In order to build a strong life, we need great boundaries, strong boundaries, clear boundaries. In this episode, I want to show you how to build them for your life and talk about the three biggest misconceptions we have about establishing boundaries in our relationships. My name is Mike Foster, and this is Strong as You. So, for many years of my life, I struggled with establishing good boundaries in relationships. I'll admit it, I was a people pleaser. I loved to serve people. I was available all the time. People loved it, but it wasn't working in my life. And I think if you're like me, establishing healthy boundaries is one of the most difficult things that we can do in our lives, but absolutely critical if we want to build a strong life and have strong relationships. So, what are boundaries? I sort of define boundaries like this. Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. See, it's not where I'm having to compromise myself or my value or my worth, or I'm putting myself in jeopardy, where I'm denying maybe something that I might need, like sleep or rest or just some space. It's the ability to really move into healthy relationship, a place where I can love you appropriately and in a whole strong way, and I can love myself at the same time. Now, a lot of times when we think about boundaries, you're like, oh man, people are going to get so mad at me if I establish boundaries. And that might be true, because when somebody is living out boundaries and establishing boundaries, that's not a normal thing. Most of us just live kind of these open lives, and people have full access, and we're showing up and people pleasing and doing everything and emotionally managing people and caught up in this really entangled mess of relationship. And so what I've found is that the only people who really get upset when you start setting boundaries are the ones that benefited when you had none. And so I realize that sometimes moving into this conversation and thinking about boundaries and creating boundaries for your life feels a little uneasy or unsure, but that's okay. We're going to move into strong relationships by having strong boundaries. So let's talk about a couple misconceptions. Maybe set your mind at ease. So number one, when we think of boundaries, sometimes we there's this myth that they're unkind or cruel, or we're being mean when we establish boundaries. No, we're just saying, again, this is the type of things that I need in my life and the distance that I need in this relationship to really love you and serve you well. Another misconception about boundaries is that they're rigid and unchanging. That we think maybe like they're brick walls and these big barriers that we build in our lives. That's not true. I like to think of boundaries as rubber bands, where they can stretch and give a little. There's still some resistance there, and there's still like a marker in our life about how far somebody can take that boundary. And they stretch, but they're not necessarily rigid or these block walls. Another misconception is that if I establish boundaries in my life, that all of a sudden I am isolating and disconnecting myself from relationship. Not true at all. Boundaries really are not about keeping others out, but allowing the person in the correct way, in the correct with your needs in mind, with their needs in mind. It's just a much healthier way to establish what you need in your life. So let's talk about, how do we build boundaries? You're like, okay, Mike, I'm in. How do I build boundaries? Well, let me give you 4 ways to do that. First, we need to define them. You got to sit down and go, what are your boundaries? Maybe with relationships with your family, or relationships with coworkers, or maybe there's somebody in your life right now that's kind of clingy and calling you at 2 o'clock in the morning. Like, you need to define what works for you and what doesn't work for you. And that's, I think, one of our biggest problems, is that we never really sit down and say, what do I want? What do I need to make a healthy relationship work here? Number 2, you gotta, after you define them, you gotta build them. You gotta create them. You have to communicate them. You have to really establish, you have to make commitments to yourself and say, these boundaries are important to me, and so I'm going to adhere to them. Number 3, we've got to display them. And what this really means is we're going to talk about them with people. We're going to have conversations around this. We are going to, whatever the boundary is, we're going to actually live it out. You see, there's no point of having a boundary if you keep breaking them or they keep getting compromised or it's just a concept in your life, but there's no movement or action associated with it. And then finally, so we define them, we build them, we display them. And then finally, we need to oftentimes reestablish them. See, there are going to be times when you break your own boundaries or people will be so insistent on you doing something for them or you compromise yourself in some way. And that's going to happen. And so the key is to then reestablish the boundary. And that's totally okay, totally normal. So we define them, we build them, we display them, and then when they're broken, we reestablish them. So let me give you two quick ways that will help you have strong boundaries. And that's by developing, one, a strong voice, and number two, strong legs. Strong voice is you need to speak up. You need to let people know what your boundaries are, what works for you, what you need. You need to be communicating that every single day in relationships. When somebody says something that you don't like, you need to speak up. And then strong legs, when it's not working for you, you leave. You don't participate. I love what Nina Simone, the great singer, says, you got to learn to leave the table when love is no longer being served. You have to decide what works for your life. It's your life. You want to build a strong life, you have to understand that you got to have strong boundaries. So let me be clear. Boundaries are important for living a strong life. You got to have them, but it means us sitting down and thinking about what are they? How do I display them? How do I communicate them? And ultimately, just because you have boundaries doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't cut you off from relationship. It doesn't mean that you're being a jerk. It means that you are interested in loving well, having healthy relationship. Again, a boundary is the distance and the space between where I can simultaneously love you and me at the same time. Hey, thanks for being with us. I would encourage you to head on over to strongestyou.org, where you can sign up to have these episodes delivered to your inbox every single week. It's totally free. You sign up at strongestyou.org, have them delivered, get some extra content. Also, we'll make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can do that right now. And don't forget to join us for Forever You this Sunday. We'll see you next time.